Hello everyone, welcome back to another session of Asynchronous Apex series. So let's just start with the future methods. So in the previous session, we talked about what an asynchronous process is and how many types of asynchronous process are available in Salesforce. So we are going to start with the future methods. All right. So so this is the agenda for the session. We'll talk about what future method is. I'll explain a little bit about it and I'll take an example and we'll go ahead and implement it. All right. So the future method is basically a set of code that runs in the background. That's the most basic definition that I have over here, right? So let's just move ahead and understand with the example that I had taken in the previous session, right? The example, let me just show you, you'll remember this. So this was the sequence of activities that I wanted to do. The first one was to take shower, get ready, go to a wedding. But then in between, I had some extra task, which was to go to laundry to give the clothes. All right. So this was something, if you remember from the previous session, this was something that didn't require my presence, right? I didn't have to be actually, I had no interaction or I had no inputs in this task, right? I had just go to the laundry shop and I had to give the clothes and then the task would be done by the laundry shop guys, right? So this one required my interaction, my presence. This one required my presence. This one required my presence. But this one was something that I could have done in the asynchronous process, right? That is what we talked about in the first session, correct? So in Salesforce, in terms of Salesforce, how will you talk about these tasks? This would be nothing but methods. So the first method would be take shower, the second would be get ready, third would be get laundry done, and then fourth one would be attend wedding. Now the biggest question is that when we were talking in the layman language, we knew that this is something that we have to push into the asynchronous process, right? Because this was something that we didn't want to put in the sequence, right? This was just taking a lot of time, right? Another 60 minutes. And then after I had to if I want everything to be sequential in synchronous, then I have to go to the laundry shop, wait for another 60 minutes to get the laundry done. Then only I could go to the wedding. But I wanted to save that 60 minutes. I wanted to just give the clothes to the laundry shop. That means to the synchronous process. And then I wanted to go to the wedding. And when this was done after 60 minutes, I would have just gone and received the clothes back. All right. So now how will you actually do it when you're writing the code? So the first process is the future method. So this time we are going to achieve this using the future methods. All right. So I will move. Okay. So before we actually move ahead, I am going to explain you a little bit about the syntax of the future method. Okay. So I think this is going a little bit outside the presentation, but that's okay. I'll still explain what I have written here. So the any method that you're writing in your Apex class, right? Any method that you write, if you're providing that method with the annotation at the rate future, then that method would be considered as future method and that method will run asynchronously. Basically, the moment Salesforce sees that there's a method and you have put this annotation, by this annotation, Salesforce will understand that this method has to be run asynchronously, right? So what does it mean? What happens in asynchronous process? Separate thread is created for that method, right? For that process. So that is the same thing which will happen for this method, right? The moment Salesforce identifies that this is annotated with future annotation, then this method will be executed in a separate thread. Okay, that is point one of the syntax. Okay, the second point of the syntax is that you always have to define your future method as static void. Why void? Because whenever you're defining this method, future method, this is not going to run at the same time, so it will not have the response or output at the same time when you're actually when this method is called, right? So that is the reason that it is defined as void, because it will not have the response at the time when you're defining it when it is executing, because it might have not processed, because it is annotated with future, right? And it will only be executed when the resources are available, right? So at the same time, the response, you will not get the response, and that is the reason that it is defined as void. Okay, now the third point of the syntax is that it only accepts primitive data types. Okay, that is what I have written here, but it's okay. So all right, so it only accepts primitive data types. Primitive means boolean, integer, or list of IDs, the way I have written here, right? But any kind of non-primitive parameters you cannot pass here. For example, object, s object, right? So I cannot, for example, I cannot pass account object here. The reason being that this particular method will be executed in future. Let's say, because it will take a little more time, right? The moment, I mean, because it is in future, it will take a little bit longer time to get executed, right? It will wait for the resources to get available, to be available, and then it will get executed, right? So by that, just imagine that if you have passed account here, and by the time it actually gets executed, let's say within that frame of time, if somebody goes and, like, like whatever the list of accounts that you have, let's say like one account, right? You have passed just one account, and that account's name is like, XYZ or something like that. And when this method actually gets executed, this will still have that name of the account XYZ, whatever, like, you had actually passed when you, like, this method was defined and it was queued. But let's say while it was executed, before its execution, somebody went and changed that account's name, right, from XYZ to ABC, right? So that will actually, like, end up in the, that will that will actually create a data inconsistency, right? Because this method had the previous account name, but then while when it got executed, the account name was already changed. And that is why in future method, you never pass a non-primitive data type, okay, as parameters. You always have to pass primitives, okay, because the IDs are not going to change, right? So that is the reason that you always have to pass primitive data types. So 3 steps for now. So you have to annotate the future method with @future annotation. Second is that it has to be static void. The third one is that it has to always accept the parameters in the primitive form. You cannot pass on non-primitive parameters, okay? Now the reason that, like, why we have defined it as static, you'll understand that if you already know that if there is any method that you have defined it as static, you can call that method directly with the help of the class. So now the second, now we already know the syntax that if you have to write a future method, these are the things that you will actually use, okay? These 3 points are very important and you have to remember this. And here you have to write your code whatever you want to run in the future, like, any logic. But now the second question is that, let's say you have written your future method. The second question is, how will you call your future method, okay? So the calling is pretty simple. This is how you call: class name dot method name, okay? Any method name. So for example, this one, let me go back to the back here, right? So this was the method that I wanted to push into the asynchronous process, right? And which asynchronous process we are talking about right now? We are talking about future method, correct? So let's say out of these 4 methods, I know my presence, my input is required here. This is fine. This one is fine. This is also fine. But this was something where my interaction was not required really, right? So this is what I wanted to push to the future method, because I want this particular method to run asynchronously, right? So let's say in my class, I have defined this method. Now I want to call this method somewhere, right? So how will I call it? So where, whatever class, whatever Apex class I have defined, and in whatever class I have kept this method, I will, if I have to call this method, then I have to give the class name dot this method name, and that's it, because this is static, and that is how you can call any static method, okay? So class name dot method name, okay? That is point number 2. Now, before we actually go here, right, let's just go ahead and try to implement this example. Okay, so I will move to the org. So I'm going to create these, I'm going to create an Apex class, and then I would be creating all these, like, 4 methods in that Apex class. And I will show you that how these methods will run synchronously, and also I will show you how these can run asynchronously using the future method asynchronous process. All right. So I'll just go to the org and we will move to the developer console. So developer console. All right. So I'm going to create a class. Let me just close these out. So Apex class. And here, let's say my future method demo. Okay. And so this is the class. So what I'm going to first create a constructor. Okay. So constructor. All right. So here, what are the methods that I have? So let's just go to the methods. I have this method first, okay? So I'm just going to copy this method. So sorry, let's just keep the constructor as it is for now. I am just going to first define the methods, okay? So this is the method, the first method. All right, so here I'm just going to put a system.debug. All right, and here char. Okay, and then I'm going to copy this method and create another method that we needed, that was to get ready. Okay, and here method definition. public static void, and here as well, public static void get ready. This was the second method, right? And here I'm just putting as get ready. Okay. And then I'm going to create a third method. So third method is, let me just, okay, third method is get laundry done. Okay. Here. All right. And the fourth method is attend the wedding. Okay. So these were the four tasks that we talked about, right? All the tasks. So here, attend wedding. Okay. And here also, I'm just going to keep it as attend wedding. Okay. And this is the constructor that I have. So constructor in a class, that means, like, whenever this class is called, constructor is the first thing that will get executed. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'll call all these methods inside my constructor. Okay. So whenever I call this constructor, all these methods would be executed. Okay. So I'm just going to first call this method. All right. Then I'm going to call this method. And then get laundry done, this method. And then attend wedding, this method. All right. So attend wedding and then this method. Okay. So I have defined all the four methods and I have called all these methods, like, and this is how you call synchronous methods. Okay. This is nothing but the synchronous process. Okay. I have all my methods and I have called my methods, like, simply like this. All right. So this is my constructor. Now I'm going to call my constructor. Okay. So if you want to, I've saved this class. If you want to execute this, then you can, like, just simply call the constructor and these methods would be executed. In order to do that, you can open the anonymous window and here you have to give the class name. Class name is my future this, and then mf like anything, and is equals to, and this is how you call the constructor new, and then the constructor name, which is nothing but same as the class name. Okay. And this, so let me just go ahead and execute this. So one second. All right. Okay. So now I have executed this method. So as per my expectation, what should happen? This method should get called. So that means this should be printed. Then this method should be called and this should be printed. This method should be called and this should be printed. This method should be called and this should be printed, right? So that is the sequence that it has to follow. That is how I have called the methods, right? So let's just go ahead and check the debugs. So whenever you run your code in the developer console, you will a debug log would be generated here. Okay, so let me just tick here. All right, and you can go to logs. So here you see that one transaction was happened and this is the log that was generated. So if I click on this, I can actually check the logs that I have printed. Okay, so I cannot just keep on scrolling. So I would rather click on debug only so that I can see all the debug statements. Okay, so here, shower, get ready, laundry, and attend wedding. Okay, everything was called in the synchronous way, the way I have called the methods. Okay, so shower, get ready, laundry done, and then attend wedding. These are the print statements that I have, right? Shower, get ready, laundry, and attend wedding. Okay, so this was the synchronous way. Now, what was the whole idea? My idea was, because I knew that I didn't want this to be, like, happening in the sequence, because I knew that this could actually, like, happen asynchronously. So I am going to make it a future method. Okay, and how do I make it a future method? What is the first step? To annotate this as the future method. Okay, so at the rate future. Okay, and then what was the second point? The second point was that future method should always be static void. So it is static void. So that's fine. The third point was that you cannot pass a non-primitive data type. But this method is like, we don't need to pass any parameters because we are not executing any such requirements. But if there is a need to pass the parameters, you always have to remember that you can only pass primitive data types, like, integer, Boolean, list of IDs and something like that, not S objects. Okay, nothing non-primitive that you have to pass here. So only primitives. All right. So we did all the three checks. Okay. Now what should happen? I have still called these methods this way. So if I execute this method, if I call the constructor, then these methods should get executed. Okay. Now let's just go ahead and see that what actually happens. So debug here, and let me just execute this. And look what happened. So when we first ran the method without future, this was the first transaction, the one I've already read the logs. Now, if you see, there are two transactions it is showing me, right? One transaction is for this method, and this method. And one transaction is specially for the future method. This is what the separate thread that we have been discussing about, that if there is any asynchronous process, then a separate thread will be created for this, for that, and a separate transaction will happen for that. Okay, so the same thing has happened. So now what is the output that I should be getting? So for this one, right, I should be getting the output for shar, getting ready, and for wedding. And in the future handler, this one, right, where the future method is executed, I should be getting the output from this one. All right, so let's just go ahead and check. So I'm just going to open the first one, and again we'll check the debug. So here, see, shar, get ready, and attend wedding, right? Laundry will come here because laundry is something that we have put in the future method. So double click here and laundry, right? So this is how, you can actually write a future method, and as per your, requirement. And this, I think this part you have, clearly understood. The moment it, realizes that there is a future annotation in front of any method, the Salesforce, while the execution happens, a separate thread will be created for this, and it will get executed in a separate transaction. All right, apart from the other single transaction that happens. Okay, now let's just go back to the PPT and see what we had next. So the question is that this was a normal example how you can write the method, but when to use the future methods. Okay, so there are three scenarios that I have listed down here, that that will actually give you an idea when you can actually use it. So for example, the first one that we saw, right, that when you want to run the code in background. So let's say if you want to, based on some logic, you want to perform any kind of deletion. Let's say you want to delete some account records when the when the account status is something, or if the account is not active, then you want to delete that account. Any kind of such logic for which you don't want it to be displayed on the UI. There's no need, right? These are the kind of operations that can actually run in the background. So if you have any such requirement, you can write a method, make it a future method, so that it will run asynchronously. And so that this is the kind of requirement where you want your code to be run in the background. So you can use that will basically fall under scenario one. So this is when you can actually use the future method. Okay. The second one is mixed DML exceptions. Now, what is mixed DML exceptions? Now, let's say that you have written a class, okay, and in your class there are you have written 3 or 4 methods. Now, let's say you are inserting a user record, okay, you are creating a user record in your in your in one of the methods of your class, and in the same class you are also inserting an account. So there are two things. There's an exception in Salesforce that if you are doing setup object and non-setup object insertion in the same transaction, then you will always encounter mixed DML error. Okay, so for example, so the question is that what are setup objects? Any kind of objects basically any setup object, for example, user object, profile object, these are the configuration setup objects, right? And anything which are for example, any custom object or any other standard object, for example, account, contact, opportunity, cases, these are non-setup objects. So if in your class, if you have written methods where you are making any kind of DML operations, mainly if you are inserting a setup object record and a non-setup object record. So in this case, for example, if you are inserting a user record and then you are also inserting account record or contact record in the same transaction, then you will encounter mixed DML error. Now, how the future method can help in this? Okay, so what you can do is that in your class, when you are inserting the user object record, you can keep it in the synchronous, And then the other record that you're actually inserting for the non-setup object, right? For example, account insertion, you can keep that particular piece of code inside a future method, because that is going to be run in a separate thread, right? That is what we just now saw, right? The method that we had actually annotated with the future method, that ran in a separate thread, right? In a separate transaction. So this kind of error can be resolved with future method. All you have to do is you have to split the code. The one with the setup object, you can keep it in synchronous, and the non-setup object, you can keep it in the asynchronous process, like, like for example, future method, or you can do it otherwise, right? The non-setup object, you can keep it in the synchronous, like, in the rest of the transaction. And for the setup object, you can actually keep it in the asynchronous process, which is nothing but the future method. Okay. So because it will have its own separate thread. So this one, the future method will run in a separate transaction, and the rest of the code will run in a separate transaction. So your mixed DML exceptions error will be resolved. You will not encounter this error. Okay. So this is another scenario where you can use future methods. The second one is to perform callouts. Okay. So callouts cannot be performed from triggers, Apex triggers. So what you can do is you can write a future method. Inside future method, you can do a callout, and then that future method you can call inside your triggers. I'm not going very deep into this point, but just keep in mind that you cannot perform callouts from triggers. If you want to do so, write a future method, inside that put your callout, and then call this future method in your Apex trigger class. Okay. So these are the points where you can use future methods. Now the last and the one of the other most important points, when we are talking about future methods, is that what are its limitations, because it is almost covering a lot of things, right? It is resolving a lot of issues that we mainly encounter. But what are the limitations? So let's just go ahead and have a look at the limitations. So the first one is that you cannot call a future method from a future method. So if you have already written a future method, and if you think that, okay, I will call another future method inside that future method, then it's not possible. Basically, asynchronous inside asynchronous is not possible. Okay. For this limitation, we have queuable and batch Apex, which we will learn in other sessions. But for now, just keep in mind that calling a future method from a future method is not possible. Okay. The second one that we already discussed, that you can only pass primitive in the parameters and not the non-primitive data types. All right. So these are the two basic limitations of future method. And I believe that you have the basic understanding of what a future method is. It's just a piece of code. The second thing is, what is the syntax? At the rate future annotation, then it has to be static void, and then you have to only pass the primitive parameters. Okay. And then the next point is how you call a future method, class name dot method name. Okay. Then the next thing that we discussed is how you can actually execute future method. Okay. For executing future method, you have to, if you have written multiple methods, the method that you will actually annotate as future, and if every checklist from the future method points, if it crosses every checklist, then what will happen when you will actually execute that class? Then that future method will have its own separate transaction, the one that we saw in developer console, right? It will be it will get executed under a separate thread. It will be named as future handler, and everything else will get executed in a separate transaction. All right. And then what are when can you use future method, right? In to avoid DML operations, you can separate setup and non-setup object record creations using future methods, because it will get executed in a separate thread. So that is when to avoid mixed DML, you can use it. If you want to perform a call out in a trigger, which is not possible, you can do it, because you can put your call out in the future, and then you can call this future method from your Apex trigger class. Okay. And what was the third point? The third point is that if there is any task that you want to run in the background, then you can use the future method. If there's anything that you actually don't want to show on the UI, and it doesn't matter if it keeps on running in the background, then that is when you can use the future methods. And then finally, these are the two limitations. All right. So in the next session, we will talk about queuable methods, and how we can we'll see what it is, and how we can actually implement it, what are the advantages and what are the limitations. All right. So I'll see you in the next session, and keep practicing. Thank you.